LD Comics is a women-led welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeton as Ladies Do Comics, today LD Comics is run by a committee of published graphic novelists: Rachel Ball, Emma Burley, Lou Crosby, Wallis Eates and Nicola Streeton. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
Some of you might be wondering why I'm called the mollusk dimension. I chose the name Squid because I'm a multidisciplinary artist, and that's the mollusk part. I'm a dimension because I feel like I'm more than a person. I'm a magical realm. My dad's surname, Ma, means horse in Cantonese, so my name is literally Squid Horse. And that's why I named my comics account Squid Horse Comics. In this talk, I'll refer to some of my intersectional struggles, such as racism, mental health, grief, transphobia, and sexism. One of my recurring themes is trying to discover joy through creativity. In this image, a musician called Cool Head Mollusk carries a keyboard towards a door marked Keep Out, which represents approaching rebellion. I studied classical piano from a young age, and only started songwriting when I came out as trans at the age of 32. Here are some of my many sketchbooks. There's a world of difference between playing beautiful classical music and expressing an opinion. I felt a lot of doubt about telling my story and taking up space. Some of the barriers I faced accessing comics include, as far as I remember, most of my teachers were white. I grew up watching UK TV and film, rarely seeing faces of East and Southeast Asians. I'll be referring to this acronym quite a bit, which can be pronounced EC or ESEA. I spent about 30 or so years identifying as a girl or woman and femme for parts of these decades. I was affected by sexism and misogyny in art, comics, and animation, including in anime. I was further impacted by being East Asian due to negative stereotypes. People who liked manga were disappointed that I didn't know how to draw manga. So where does my art belong? Here are most of the 18 or so zines that I've made. Somewhat neurodivergently, they all have different titles, and one was a 3D pop-up zine. The first 3 issues used black ink only, and I started printing in full color with Mr. Carrot is Lost in Hong Kong, second row on the left. That one broke my printer, and I only managed to print 3 copies. I tried a risograph printer and some commercial printers. I've selected 3 zines to tell you more about. Here are the 2 covers for my first zine, First I Sprout Fangs. After reading zines as a teenager, finally at the age of 28, I made my first zine. Here's how it happened. My friend Shiloh said, "First I Sprout Fangs," and I said, "Oh, that could be the name for my zine." I was really inspired by a Berlin artist called Gabba, who did a presentation on her zine and arts at a feminist grassroots event called Women's Anarchist Nuisance Cafe, run by my late friend Caro. I asked Gabba loads of questions, which she patiently answered me. Thanks to her, I became interested in screen printing. And in a burst of creativity, I went all out with 2 different covers, hardback and softbacks. Got really into screen printing, printed these with my longtime collaborator, Shaven Raven Designs, at London Printworks in Brixton, which sadly closed in 2013. Shaven Raven also helped me to screen print some t-shirts, which I'll show you soon. Here are some images from the scene. They are digitally edited scans of pen drawings, but the actual paper was an off-white called Popset Cloud. I love the name. The range of topics in the drawings gives you an idea of the range in most of my zines. Imaginary, quirky conversations, mental health, relationships, random, whimsical stuff. And there's a mini version because I made it to check that the pages were in the right order. This was before I knew how to make a PDF. And I printed my pages at home and took them to the printer down the road and asked them to do double-sided copies. And then I went home and sewed them by hand. There's a video of this zine, which I'll share the link of later. In Low-Key Zine, I started talking more openly about depression and anxiety. When I went to the gender clinic, the psychiatrist said that some of my mental health issues were existential. The illustration on the front cover is a musician joke about a very low and also absent note. The front cover is a doorway to discover darker colors and deeper vibrations, revealing magic. The gold of the frame is actually an ordinary graphite pencil scanned in using the color setting, then I played around with the settings. Those tiny green lights, as I remember, they're pixels. I'd got the effect using a filter in Photoshop, but it wouldn't let me save it. So guess what? I placed each pixel on there one by one. In exploring depression and anxiety, I used sea imagery and also quirky jokes. Here you can see dark blue monochromatic sort of colors and some more lurid colors in the giant strawberry. And also photography. There's a trajectory from diagonal bottom left to top right in some of my art. And there's also a parallel with my songs, which tend to go from low or depressed and go on a fantastical or uplifting journey. On the bottom right, the 9 small square photos are track art from a collection of late-night dreamy piano improvisations. Fluid, fleeting, romantic, and explorative. I recorded them while I was waiting for my partner at the time to return from work. I called the EP Dream Improvisations. Like some of my piano music, the music only exists as recordings currently, so I'll share those later. Here's some of my teenage artwork. While my parents wouldn't let me study art at art college, I was actually really lucky that they let me study it for GCSE and A-level. Many Chinese parents and Asians, immigrants in general, and the government still don't view art as a useful subject. I did a lot of self-portraits. The piece on the left and middle are examples. The middle one looks a bit disturbing. I was watching a lot of MTV grunge and alternative rock music videos at the time. I'm in the photo in the middle because I took the photo a few years ago when I was clearing out my artwork. On the right is a painting of my late grandpa, my mum's dad. I captured him in a moment of inspiration, eyes shining, describing a scene or telling a story. He was very eccentric and creative. Here are 2 pieces of art called Tiger Girl and Leave Me Alone, which are 2 of my feminist classics. For Tiger Girl, I had a story in my mind of a girl who turned into a tiger for self-protection. She was on posters, postcards, and stickers, which I sold or gave away. I screen printed Tiger Girl on red t-shirts. You can see one in the middle. And one day I might reprint some in more colors, because red isn't everyone's color. Leave Me Alone is about overcoming creeps on the street. Someone somewhere has a tattoo of this character. I used Leave Me Alone for the cover of a song, Don't Call Me Darling, which is about getting annoyed when one is called darling by random men. I regret to hear it's still very much valid. As well as producing most of my work as a solo artist, I had some amazing times in my artist collective where we interacted with the public. Interactive Monster Unit was our name when it was International Nobody and Dorothy Damage, 2 queer Black artists, and myself. Around 2018, Our friend Wild, a white non-binary artist, joined. We changed our name to Craft Bistro, spelt with a Q. We booked a table at zine fairs and invited the public to do something quick and creative. It's also nice to offer something to kids. We did mask making, monster character designs, sticker drawing, sock puppet making. That was hilarious. I also ran some activities on my own. It was always voluntary, although we sometimes took the donations. I didn't realise that artists could get paid for doing workshops. Due to commitments, we disbanded. However, we're still friends and support each other. There are more photos and info on my website. One of the, for me, coolest things we did as Craft Bistro was resist. We'd pre-cut out the letters and International Nobody, Dorothy Damage and I ran this public workshop at Decolonise Fest, London's first festival for and run by BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous and/or people of colour. It took place at DIY Space for London, sadly closed in 2020. We invited people to queer resistance by bringing our queerness in the celebration and/or remembrance of loved ones, cultural and political icons. I believe it was maybe the first time we'd worked together to create a unified piece. Resist was exhibited at the Genesis Cinema in Mile End and the Battersea Arts Centre. Corona racism, the name for COVID-related racism towards East and Southeast Asians, unfortunately rose by over 300% in the first quarter of 2020. During the lockdown, while shopping for my elderly mum, someone shouted coronavirus at me, which made my anxiety and depression much worse. To feel safer to leave the house, I wrote a song so that I could hum it as I walked the dog. The song is called Asians Have Feelings Too, and it's about attempting to refine joy and community after not just one experience, but a lifetime of isolation and hostilities. Together with a mostly East and Southeast Asian team, producer Tue Van Huynh, queer director Darius Xu, we made a music video for Asians Have Feelings Too, with funding from the Arts Council and a crowdfunder. The music video features some of these illustrations by me and animation, as well as my song and performance, including me doing some imitation K-pop dancing. Won a Trans Pride Brighton Award and had 11 screenings. If you're curious, you can find it on YouTube later and check out the song. Alas, COVID is still very much around. Interestingly, to make Asians Have Feelings Too, the entire team were asked to do negative COVID tests before all the rehearsals and shoots. I was really inspired by Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate movements, seeing people of all backgrounds holding signs with these messages in solidarity. So I invited people to join me online and create their own placards with the message Asians Have Feelings Too. People aged between 10 and 74 from various backgrounds joined me. I was really surprised that quite a few people drew squids and sea creatures, which I was very happy about. In the video of Asians Have Feelings Too, there's a cozy scene of some Asians gathering at a table, not pictured here, you can see it on the video, apparently creating protest art, which represents my longing to find community. And on the wall in the background are these wonderful posters. Let's take a drink of tea. Before my comics account was called Squid Horse Comics, it was called Mr. Carrot Comics. It was all about a character called Mr. Carrot navigating traumatic bereavement, being trans, and trying to cope with his mum's dog eating everything. I created a comic about my experience of corona racism. My comic and blog piece were published by a groundbreaking organisation called Be Seen, which stands for British East and Southeast Asian Network, which has done so much to support and encourage ESEA people. Responding to corona racism, Be Seen founded EC Heritage Month every September to celebrate EC culture and raise awareness. As I felt unable to show my vulnerability and struggles as a child and even as an adult, being heard by EC intersectional feminists in Be Seen meant so much. I'm really grateful to them for platforming me. This is just one panel of the comic. Perhaps some of the people listening tonight might have found me through Be Seen. Currently, if you Google British-born Chinese comics on Google Images, you find this Corona Racism comic by me, hopefully. The other search result is the comic American-born Chinese, and other search results are comics which are Chinese from a long time ago. It would be a dream to make a mark as a British Chinese comics creator. The comic you just saw will be in The Weird and Wonderful Survivories of Squidhorse, my first autobiographical comic book, which explores mental health, intersectionality, and so on. Here are 4 panels from a different story called 90s Teen. Snapshots from my Disney watching childhood to being a grunge kid wannabe teen and wondering why I never looked like the models in J17 or Ms. Magazine. The 5th panel, not shown here, alludes to a teenage mental health episode. If you want to check it out, the whole 6-panel comic is on my Instagram and it will be in the book. By reading and finding out about me, I hope to inspire East and Southeast Asians and others to talk about difficult topics, such as the ones I've mentioned tonight, and make their own comics. I've been applying for funding to publish this, which has been something of a struggle, but I'm grateful for support and determined to continue. Comics are amazing for mental health, and comics should be for everyone, not just middle-class white cishet men. Although I'm not suggesting that they should be denied comics, because comics should be for everyone. Here's some of my creative process. On the left is a scan of the original drawing, which I did in pink pen. On the right, my first color version, which someone bought as a poster. And in the middle, it's the most recent version. You might notice I've been painstakingly adding gutters to help with readability. If there are any Sandman fans, you might notice a reference to how the character Morpheus speaks with my black speech bubbles. Most of my comics were drawn when I wasn't feeling so great, about 4 a.m., by dividing a piece of A4 paper into 6 panels, a way to process bad feelings in a short story. Completing a story doesn't mean closure, but it often means I can go back to sleep for a bit more. Some of the originals are drawn on the backs of the academic journals I photocopied for research during my English degree. The English degree my parents made me do instead of art. This next slide has brief references to missing person trauma. This image looks very different to the others. In 2023, I attended a short comics course with Alexis Deacon. He encouraged us to explore different shaped panels. Consequently, some of my comics start with a title panel that immerses the reader into a scene or mood. Looks like a travel or holiday advert, ironically in sharp contrast with the sad and difficult experience of looking for my dad. I guess you'll have to read my book to find out what happens. As a trans person, I feel very emotional about protecting trans kids and trans young people, as well as trans adults. Trans rights campaigner D. Lou Whitnell invited people to use the Instagram, I just made a new word up, Instagram hashtag trans kids deserve to grow up. I feel that the most vulnerable are made to be societal scapegoats because bigoted leaders simply cannot bear to imagine people from different backgrounds and cultures growing and thriving together. Many people are still woefully unaware that trans people have actually been around for thousands of years. As we are all too aware, colonialism and occupation tries to destroy people, history, culture, and harmonious ways of being. I feel that school should be a place for learning how to build community. I went to school with followers of 6 major religions. I don't follow any of them, but I learned to be more open-minded and respectful of other people's beliefs. Look at the characters in the piece on the right carefully, because these trans kids grow up and form a band. My song Insomnia was originally a love song The chorus is about someone keeping me up all night. But when it got to 2023, it was J.K. Rowling keeping me up all night with her trans misogyny. Insomnia is a surf rock versus Rowling song. Do you see what I did there? The artwork shows some variations in the characters, but I guess that's what you can get from hormones, though they have a lot more grey hairs. In the photos on the right, you can see me performing Insomnia with the Bit and Peach UK at the RVT, plus a mysterious person who spontaneously joined me on stage, had the most amazing facial expressions. Found out later they're a fabulous dancer called Audrey Corno. Very quick glimpse of my most recent zine, How I Survived My Teenage Years. The style is different to most of the other characters you've seen. It's the light-hearted version. It was originally in black and white. On the front cover, I'm wearing the pride of my late teens, a Matrix-style second-hand black leather trench coat, possibly from Camden Market, crossing a ravine. I had an idea to have a zine within the comic book, like the Jolly Postman, but I think that'd be kind of expensive. It's a really stressful and difficult year, but it was wonderful to share my art with people. I took How I Survived My Teenage Years and art to events where I met some really wonderful people. Here are some photos from Gather and Grow, organised by ESEA Sisters, EC Cultural Festival, organised by Kanlungan, SIAC and Bayhead Kubing Housing Association, the Query Brighton and Helsinki Comics Fest a few months ago, where I took selfies with LD Comics people, Nicholas Streeton, tonight's host, Wallis Eats, and Rachel House. Coming to the end of my talk. Here's a glimpse of a few more of my comics. There isn't time to show you all of them, so if you'd like to check them out, please visit me on Instagram or Facebook at Squidwell's Comics. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining tonight and listening. Hope you've enjoyed your visit to the Mollusk Dimension. In case it's helpful, I'll share a blog with all the links to the things I talked about. I still have some copies of my zine. And if you'd like to support me, please buy a copy. While I'm applying for funding, sales help me pay bills, pay for printing, and I can also be hired to compose music. If you're on any of these platforms, please follow me. As I lack confidence and have neurodivergence, I find responses to my posts really reassuring and encouraging. Likes, shares, saves, etc. are all very much appreciated. And I have a few events coming up, so I'll share about those. Thanks again, and I will hand you back over to Wallis. Or should that be tentacle you back over?
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about I can't seem to transition my slides, which is I can do it from the bottom there.
Yeah, okay. That's working fine from this end.
So I'm talking about current PhD work, and I'm doing a practice-based PhD in illustration, specialising in graphic novels. And I've got 4 areas of focus, and I'm going to be showing some works in progress that are to do with these 4 areas. So first-person focalization, representations of mind, intermediality, and page versus panel. And I'll start just by, can you see that thing that's in the top right corner there, or are you just seeing my slides?
Just seeing your slides and you, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. I don't need to worry about that then. Okay. So I'll start by explaining what I mean by focalization, and we'll look at how films represent focalization. So they often represent a story that's being told from the perspective of a main character, and it's usually from an external camera shot, though. So then what we're seeing is the person who's experiencing, we're following, as we follow them. So we might still learn about their world from their subjective perspective, but we're simultaneously able to see them objectively in their surroundings. And we see this in most comics and graphic novels. So a favourite of mine here, Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson. In this comic strip, we follow a 6-year-old boy called Calvin, and we're seeing the world through his eyes most of the time. And we're kind of experiencing and enjoying all the things that a typical 6-year-old boy might, or whatever that might mean. He has a best friend who is a tiger called Hobbes. And when the story is focalized through Calvin's eyes, we see Hobbes as the real living tiger that Calvin experiences him as. Sometimes, in true 6-year-old fashion, Calvin explores the world with a vivid imagination, and we see him here as his alter ego being chased by an enormous alien being. We see what he imagines the world to look like during his imaginative play and are completely immersed in his world, but viewing it from this external camera lens. Now, sometimes the focalization switches and we see the world from other characters' perspectives, like Susie, his friend. And in several panels here, we see Hobbes as Susie sees him, but in panel 6, we see Hobbes as Calvin experiences him as a real tiger. And every so often, Bill Watterson pulls away from Calvin's focalization and gives us someone else's viewpoint. And this is also very much based in the tradition of film. Lots of graphic narratives follow this tradition. But in literature, in novels, we have a different approach. We've got first-person narration in novels that allows the reader to inhabit the narrator's mind's eye and see the world from their subjective point of view. And I'm interested in how can an authentic first-person focalization be used in a graphic novel? How can you genuinely have a first-person narrative where the reader inhabits that character, but doesn't necessarily ever get to see them objectively? So on to my work now. I'm super interested in how to convey how we think, how we feel, especially when we're being creative. So how do we feel when we're gearing up to make art? And this piece is me trying to strip away some of the objective representations of people and to replace that with subjective representations. So how we might experience someone. Or, so for instance, in this piece, the figure that we're seeing here isn't our main character, it's someone that our main character is looking at. And this cloud that is behind that character is an abstract representation of a thought bubble. It's kind of like a mood cloud. So I'm just trying to find the right language visually for all of this stuff. And I don't know about you, but when I'm sitting talking with another person, how I view the physicality of them and the space that we're in, that can change substantially depending on the tone of the conversation we're having, what's being said, whether I'm hungry, whether I'm cold. I sometimes sit and trace the features of the person that I'm looking at in my mind as if it's a continuous line drawing. So in this piece, we have the main image of a person that our character might be looking at. But to the left of him, there's this dark shape that is an echo of his head and torso, and it has a continuous line drawing on one side of his face. But in my art, I'm trying to represent the playfulness of our minds, the distractions that might occur, what we notice, what we fail to notice. And this is about finding a visual language for me that I might use in a graphic narrative that can express the subjective experiencing of a moment where not every detail needs to be noticed. In this work, the figure we see is someone our main character, our protagonist, is looking at again. And our character is waiting in silence for this man to respond. So we see our character's thoughts wrap around this figure and inhabit their shared space. We're not getting loads of information about the context, the placement, the environment. Instead, the focus is on the mind of our focalizer and the atmosphere of the environment as that focalizer perceives it and experiences it. A crucial element that I'm interested in is how to represent the inner workings of the mind. So a traditional example would be to show thought via a thought bubble. And comics tend to use an iconic language. You know, it's got a fast way of communicating to the reader, and the reader has a speedy way of receiving and interpreting that. But what if we were to slow all of that down in the way that you sometimes get with fine art, or that you might get with traditional literature? And how would that work for a graphic novel reader? This piece is all to do with unhelpful, repetitive thoughts. We talk about goldfishes going round and round in circles. So I've used this as a metaphor here for looped thoughts. And we've got a swirl of text, which is a continuous stream of consciousness. It's a negative ranting of the mind that says things like, I won't let myself be used like this again. I just won't. I'm not a pathetic doormat. And it's just one of those ranty, ongoing, chattering internal monologues that we sometimes have, particularly if we feel like there's been some sense of injustice or things haven't gone our way. But I'm trying to establish how text and image could work together to create this sense of thinking. In this piece, I'm trying to show how thoughts can lead to other thoughts or build on one another. We've got three references here visually. There's the Uffington white horse from Oxfordshire. We've got a Nazca line from Peru of a hummingbird, which is another type of geoglyph inscribed into the landscape. And then there's a reference to the Shubeik cave paintings. So those horses here from over 30,000 years ago. And this piece really is all to do with thought and the history of drawing. So the way that our minds can bunny hop from one example to another when you're thinking about a theme. Oh, sorry, I haven't quite finished with that one. Within the flow of this landscape, we've got suggestions of which thought came first and which led to another. So there's an implied sequencing here that's suggested without the use of panels. And it begins with a line from that largest bubble, the one that contains the white horse, continuing down to the hummingbird bubble, which is laid over the white horse. So I'm trying to suggest here ways that thoughts can sometimes layer up in your head quite quickly, and to the point where you don't necessarily know what came first. But one thought might seem more dominant than the other, even though you've had those thoughts seemingly simultaneously in your mind. And if we follow the line round further, we get to a little thought bubble that's completely empty, but it's got a really emphasized, repeatedly drawn line around it. So I'm trying to suggest here that there are those moments where you have thoughts that you can't quite get to. They're present, but there's a frustration within yourself because you can't quite access them. They're just at the tip of your brain. And the line continues on to a thought bubble that has popped, which is me trying to draw those moments where you've definitely had a thought, but it's fleeting and you've lost it and you can't get it back. And then that leads on to the final bubble that has these cave painting horses from the Shubeik cave. And this piece suggests as a whole, a sequencing of thought, but it all takes place within the page rather than in separate panels. So I'm exploring using the whole page effectively as a panel rather than as individual frames, because I feel like that's closer really to authentic experiencing of the world. And I'm interested in how to depict the idea of thoughts and how they behave sometimes. They seem to flow in and out of our physical environment with us. So they might interconnect with or influence or interrupt conversations that we're having in quite a fluid way. And I'm trying to find the language for that. And in parallel to all of this, I am trying to develop metaphorical characters that represent the complexity of the creative process. And I don't quite know how I'm going to use these yet, but I'm fond of them and I wanted to share them with you. And the characters on the right, I call the balloon people, and the characters on the ground, I call the stone people. And I quite like the fact that in my head, I'm still not certain who they are or what land they live in, what story world they're part of, or how any of this fits with any of the other story world that I'm gradually working on. And the balloon heads are obviously, they're like floating heads, but they've got this real heaviness to them and solemnity. They seem powerfully judgmental and not what you'd expect from lovely, fun, lightweight balloons. And then the stone people that you might think would be more likely to be solemn and miserable, they seem quite quiet and peaceful. I see them as static beings, things that would have to be picked up and put down. They can't just move about of their own accord, but there seems a real acceptance within them about that fate in my head. And then these are a different kind of more stone people, but these are in a totem now, a totem of creativity. So this is another reference to the creative process and how when you're about to make art, or you're in the middle of doing so, or after you have made some art, there are all these different internal voices that talk to you, giving their opinion about what's good, what's not, what you should have done, and what you should do next. And some of these can be deeply unhelpful, and some of them can be like overly indulgent. But I'm also interested in intermedial elements in my work. So that is crossovers between different art forms and how art forms might overlap and communicate with each other. So this is a piece of poetry that I've written, but I'm interested in how this kind of work is not the sort of thing that you can read aloud in the same way that you could traditional poetry. A lot of comics and graphic novels forms are much harder to read aloud than, say, picture books or novels, traditional novels. But I'm even more interested in how thoughts can interrupt a creative process like that of writing a poem. So this is a view into the internal workings of a poet's mind. They're trying to write a poem, and we see the evidence of that and the thinking that is surrounding their writing. So it's not the sort of thing that can be easily read out loud, but I'm going to give it a try whilst also trying to explain what's going on. So we've got some text that is typed, which is the written poem, and some text that is handwritten, which is the internal thought processes of the poet. We also have textless moments like the bubble in the center, which is full of what could be tension or anxiety, distraction, some kind of energy there that isn't particularly helpful. And also, it starts something about shadows. And this is the poet trying to consider how to start the poem. What's the way in? So something about shadows, ground shadows. And then visually what we have next is, yes, that's good. But actually, if you follow the line of the thought bubbles, that bit doesn't come next. So this is why it's the sort of thing that doesn't work when being read aloud, because you, as the reader, you have to work out all of this. You have to work out the sequencing. How does it flow? What comes where? And I like that. I like the fact that it isn't easily sequential. But something about shadows, ground shadows, voices deep in the rock face throughout the ages, the way sounds move. Yeah, that's good. The way words make wounds. And then at this point, we have that sort of visual electrical activity that interrupts, and the thought switches to, shit, she's in my head again. And then you get a line away to fuck. And then lots of more kind of distraction in all of that mark making on the left-hand side. And then we come back to the typed poem again. Two clay bison hidden in a cave. Time is burnt on the fire, charcoal dead. And then in thought, brittle. And that brittle is softer, lighter, as though it's just a quiet thought. And it ties back with all of that electrical disturbance that occurred when the poet's thinking was interrupted and distracted by thoughts of someone else. And so when we read that, we connect the brittleness really to the poet's emotional state at that point. So it's a way of visually linking the unseen creative, the poet, with both the creative act in motion and their creative product, their poem. I'm also exploring how to use the whole page as a panel in my graphic novel work, which avoids the normal use of sequential panels, hopefully creating something that's a bit more ambiguous and fluid. So this is a fold out, and if I can make it work, here we go. You can see that it folds out, revealing more to do with that particular scene. So the scene itself is an image of a woman at a table in a completely empty environment. Hang on, here we go. And the empty environment's typical of me at the moment, but she's saying in quite an emphatic way, it reminds me of Basquiat. So that's a reference to the famous painter. And then in response to this, there's a big thought bubble that is coming from our unseen protagonist that says, quick, say something. And this is the inside space of that fold out when it's fully extended. So I don't know if you've ever had this experience when you're in conversation with someone and they say something really emphatic or intelligent that requires a response from you. And all your brain comes up with in that moment is, oh, it's your turn to speak, or hurry up, they're waiting for you to say something, rather than actually giving you an idea of what to say. It's very unhelpful. So your mind is literally just instructing you that you need to act without giving you any of the tools to do so. Now, this is a detail from that fold out. So we get a speech bubble for the unseen character, our protagonist, that says, I love his use of line. And then the woman who has been speaking, the visible character, we're now starting to see her in a variety of quite different ways in response to the protagonist's subjective viewing of her. So she's now saying, yeah, the work is brutal, but also beautiful. And then as she continues talking more, she says raw, but we're seeing her in a raw way that is stylistically linked a little bit to Basquiat's work. And all these little shifts in style are connected to how our protagonist is experiencing the conversation and projecting thoughts onto the surroundings around them. The fold-out element reveals more of this particular moment without that moment being interrupted by a page turn. So that's the end of the work that I'm going to show you, but I'm going to finish by asking a big request of you, which is I'm doing a PhD. And at some stage, I need to ask people what they think of the work from a reader's perspective. I'm doing the PhD part-time, so this is going to take place over the next 5 years. And I'll be asking a range of people from all sorts of different interests. But of course, I'm particularly interested in people who are enthusiastic readers of graphic novels and comic books. So I'll need to know more about what readers think to the work and how it functions for them as a reader. And I'd love anyone here to be part of that user testing. You could participate as a one-off thing, or perhaps be part of a regular group. And I'm also going to be conducting questionnaires and interviews. So if that suits you better, then great, get involved in that. But basically, any help you're prepared to give me would be hugely appreciated and would really benefit my work. So these are my contact details, and a big thank you in advance to anyone who gets in touch to participate. And a huge thank you to LDC today for having me. It's the first time I've showcased my graphic novel developmental work, so thank you. And I'm excited to take questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and also thank you to the previous two presentations because they were both very fascinating. I enjoyed learning about your work, and I also enjoyed the discussions on the technicalities of comics because I'm going to also be talking a little bit about that today. So Before I start, I did want to say the illustration that's currently my desktop background is by my friend Bora Awu, who is a Palestinian children's illustrator. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about children's illustrations today. But she is also currently raising money to her family out of Gaza and also to rebuild their house and her art studio, which was bombed. So I'll be sharing the link to her GoFundMe in the chat if any of you would like to donate. And she's also an incredibly talented artist. So I think many of you enjoy looking at her work and especially looking at some of the symbolism she uses in light of the previous presentation.
I was just sharing the GoFundMe to my friend's art. And I was talking about how a lot of, as we were talking about symbolism and the devices that you use in comics that are also quite available in children's illustrations and political illustrations as well. And that's something I'm going to talk about today. So first, let me introduce my work. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deena Mohamed. I am an Egyptian comics artist. I am also a writer and translator. So the book you may know me from is Shubeik Lubeik, which is here. The UK version is known as Your Wish is My Command. It's the exact same book. It is just a different title. So this is a graphic novel that I wrote. It was originally published in 3 parts in Arabic. I have the Arabic versions here. I always like to do this little party trick. And the English version is also the same as the Arabic in that it's similar to manga. You read it from right to left. And the story of these 3 books is that they take place in a world. So the English is the collected version. So it's all 3 books as one book. Hang on, I'll show you guys. It's sort of the same. It's quite big. And the story is about a world where you can buy and sell wishes, and the more expensive a wish is, the more likely it is to grant your desire. So if you buy an expensive first-class wish that is sold in a bottle, sort of like the bottles on the covers, that one will grant your wish exactly. But if you buy a cheap third-class wish, it's more likely to trick you. So for example, if you wish to lose weight, your arms and legs would fall off. And each of these 3 parts, the story revolves around a man who runs a kiosk in Cairo. So kiosks are sort of like corner shops, or, you know, where you might get your drinks or your cigarettes. This is a kiosk here. It's also on the back of the book. And he has 3 first-class wishes that his father left him, but he doesn't want to use them because he believes wishes are haram, religiously impermissible. And so the story is about where each of these 3 wishes that he has goes. He decides to sell them because he's in debt. And sort of each of these books is about people wishing for something. And they sort of revolve around the themes that I considered when I thought about wishes. And usually when I think about things that people might want, I sort of decided to divide them into themes of like happiness, health, grief. So the first part is about grief. The second part is about a student with depression who's deciding how to wish for happiness. And the third part is about a friend of the kiosk owner who's sick and he has to decide if he's willing to use a wish on them. So in brief, that is what my graphic novel is about. But actually today, I kind of thought I would use my presentation time a little differently. So rather than talking about my work, I thought about talking about what inspires my work and how I conceive of comics in general as an Egyptian comics artist. So I thought I would talk to you guys a little bit about the history of Egyptian comics, because most people just don't know anything about it. And it is one of my passions. So one of the reasons I got into graphic novels is because I used to do a webcomic. And after that, I got interested in learning about the history of Egyptian comics. So I did my undergraduate research on the history of Egyptian comics. And that kind of inspired me to do this graphic novel. So I will right now be just showing you guys some, so these are the covers in Arabic. These are the 3 parts. So this is some of the earliest Egyptian comics. Most people cite the one on the right, which is called Al-Atfal, and it came out in 1923. So they usually say this is the earliest Egyptian comic, but actually before that, in 1883, well, and even slightly before that, there was a comic called Abu Naddara, which was like it was explicitly like a political satire comic. And most people define comics as sequential art. So they say that usually it has to be a sequence to be considered as comics and not just like a political cartoon or an editorial cartoon. But Abu Naddara had quite a few sequential scenes like the one I'm showing you here. So personally, I count Abu Naddara as the first Egyptian comic. Some people do, some people don't. But what I find interesting about it is that it is quite satirical and it is quite humorous. And I do like that the very first Egyptian comic was actually like explicitly like an anti-colonial paper that was distributed sort of against the, British and Ottoman rule. And so this is a little example of it. If we go to the next one, so I skipped a few, but this is another moment that I find quite momentous in Egyptian comics. This is a comic by Duraya Shafiq, who was a very big sort of influential cultural worker and writer, and she had this magazine called Al Katkut, which was for children. And in this one, you can see that they've started to use color. It's slightly more advanced. This is in 1946. So I always find it like a good moment, especially for talking about ladies doing comics. And after that, there is Hussein Bikar, who was he was a multidisciplinary artist. So he started this children's magazine called Sindbad. And this is it. And you can see sort of that little character there, who is Sindbad with his little dog mascot. And he was also a fine artist. He was a concept artist. He did really, really beautiful art. And he was quite influential. So this is Hussein Bikar. He was a big inspiration. He's one of the earliest inspiration for a lot of other artists that were to come. And you can kind of see here, he has like a sort of Franco-Belgian style in his cartooning as well, in the lines and in the colors. So from Hussein Bikar, we move to this. This is like a more very traditional comics. You can see here they've had like speech bubbles, they have lettering. This is Karawan by Mohamed Lubeik. It's very bold colors, very stylistic cartooning. And Karawan was started by Mahri. So this is also Mohamed Lubeik's work. He did children's illustrations. He was a graphic designer. In the Arabic version of my book, I handwrite most of the lettering. I don't know if you guys can see here, but this one, when I use the narration, I use a font, and the font is actually based on Mohamed Lubeik's handwriting. So he's very, very influential, and his handwriting is a font now that some comic artists use. Actually, it's very popular now, but when I used it, not a lot of people were using it still at the time. So this was around 2018 when Shubeik Lubeik Part 1 came out. And you can see here, like, there's a lot of things that I personally want to highlight is that a lot of Egyptian comic artists were working in a lot of disciplines at once, and they were very much political satirists, as well as children's cartoonists, as well as people who made posters. They did not limit themselves to one field. It was never a sort of they were just very much artists. They were people who sort of used art and visual arts in every discipline of their lives. And this is something that continues today, and it's something I'm trying to sort of carry into my own work. And they also, insofar, all of them also had a very big streak of cultural critique. So another artist, so this is Samir, which was one of the biggest children's magazines in Egypt. It started in 1956. It had a mix of translated cartoons and Egyptian cartoons. Interestingly, Samir also was used to introduce Mickey into Egypt. So Mickey comics are the biggest Arabic comics for a long time. They were, and they used Samir sort of as a platform to launch Mickey into Egypt. So you can see here that is like an Egyptianized Mickey right there. And then the cover on the right is by Helmi Touni, who is another big inspiration for me personally. So Helmi Touni is also someone who used to do a lot of children's illustration. He used to do a lot of poster designs. He was a graphic designer as well as an artist, as well as a children's illustrator, as well as a political cartoonist. And he had a very folkloric style. So he was someone who liked to use very bold shapes and very specific sort of this flat and very evocative kind of 2D sort of style. And it's one of those things that helps because I use a lot of black and white in my art. So to see a lot of artists and how they stylize quite simple patterns and how they are able to use patterns in this way, I think was very influential to me personally. And these were some of the posters that Helmi Toon used to make, especially in the 70s. A lot of them are on the Palestine Poster Project, if you guys would like to check that out. It's a really wonderful archive. And I think you can also see here, like, this border that he has in the children's book was one of the things that I considered influential. I mean, a lot of Arab art loves a good border, but when I was designing the cover for the English version, I tried to also incorporate some of those more folkloric patterns into the border. And then here we go into like all of these people and then the sort of comics and cartoons they were making. So these are editorial cartoons and political cartoons. Some of them were sequential, some of them weren't. You can see here that a lot of them have like these sort of very exaggerated sense of political cartooning. And I think there was a time when political cartooning was really big in the West, especially like the eras of like grunge magazines and Mad magazines and things like that. And I think today you don't really see them as much anymore, except perhaps like in the New Yorker. But in the Arab world, they were really, really influential to the point like the president used to read the cartoon every single day and see what it was saying about him. So political cartoonists used to have quite a big impact in the world and used to have quite an influential position. And they were very talented. A lot of their work was very evocative. A lot of it was very smart. And these are today's political cartoonists. So one of the big moments in contemporary Egyptian cartooning is Tuk Tuk, which is a magazine. I have an issue of it here. It was started directly after the Egyptian Revolution, so in 2011. They were not like, actually within the revolution, they were launching it. They also have a collected edition here. That's like a lot of their books. So Tuk Tuk is big for me because not only is it like an incredibly well-designed work that brings together a lot of really smart and influential comics artists, but it's also very progressive and bold work. So in every issue, they would always talk about contemporary issues. There was a lot of cultural critique, there was a lot of political commentary, and it was usually very funny and very smart. And for me, I think Tuk Tuk was a very important influence because when I talk about the history of Egyptian comics, you can see that we had a really strong sort of contemporary movement. And then unfortunately, there was a sort of recession and comics sort of disappeared out of, especially for adults. There were no longer really good comics to read. And then Tuk Tuk and a bunch of other things came along in like the 2010s, which was sort of the renaissance of Egyptian comics. And these were the people who contributed to that renaissance. So I quite enjoyed Tuk Tuk as an example. And it was also just really fun for me to see so many aspects of like modern Egyptian life illustrated. I don't know, because when you read a lot of translated work, it becomes a novelty to see like Egyptian streets and Egyptian signs illustrated. It's just something that's very delightful. And that's something I tried to carry on into my work. It's this sense of authenticity that when you see it, you feel like, ah, this looks like an Egyptian beach. This looks like an Egyptian wedding. You're sort of like pleased by that. And so these are also panels from Tuk Tuk. And you can see here that they sort of had a lot of different artists contributing and they used a lot of different styles. But it was always very thoughtful and very, very well done work. So in the spirit of political cartooning, because you can't really separate comics in Egypt from editorial cartoons. They're very much the same field. All of the biggest comics artists were also political cartoonists. For here, this is Dua El Adl, who's one of my favorite currently working political cartoonists. And in 2015, you can see during the attack at Charlie Hebdo in France, there was a lot of Egyptian cartoonists who used to make comics about this. And this was one of the comics she made on the right here, where it's like two militants kind of reading the Quran upside down. And then they're saying, we did what was right, right? So it's like a sort of a statement on how they're not able to follow their own religion. And it's a critique of the violence that they have. So a big theme for many political cartoonists in Egypt, you can see here they're dressed as donkeys as well. They have donkey ears and donkey tails. So it's quite a sharp critique of them. And that also on the left, you have another critique on the attack of the press by like Israeli forces currently. And that has been doing a lot of work on these two subjects lately. So these are some of her current cartoons on the attack on Palestinian journalists, which if you don't know, 109 Palestinian journalists have been killed over the past 3 months. And for a lot of Egyptian journalists as well, who have been kind of struggling to continue their work as normal, I think this is one of the things that you can see sort of the pattern of critique and the attention to the freedom of the press, which is something that a lot of cartoonists specifically hold sacred because it's also a threat to their own work. And so like a lot of, for example, the people who worked on Tuk Tuk are now no longer in Egypt, they're in exile. And that is one of the cartoonists who still works in Egypt today. And so I find her work really, really strong and powerful and very brave. So these are some of Daya's cartoons. She does editorial cartoons instead of comics, but to me, she's also someone who, for example, I see at Cairo Comics, which is our local comics festival. So for me, what I love the most is how all these fields intersect. I love seeing children's illustrators and political cartoonists and comics artists in the same space, because I also think that all art sort of goes together. So Magdi Shafai was the first person to do a graphic novel in Egypt in 2008. And he released a graphic novel called Metro. This is I'm just giving you guys like a brief overview on history, because this was a very big milestone for Egyptian comics. Metro was eventually banned in Egypt because it was also quite politically critical. The Arabic version was banned, but it was translated into English, and after the revolution, the Arabic version was released again. And Magdi Shafai continues to work in Egypt. He's one of the founders of Cairo Comics, and he's personally a great mentor to me. So he was also one of the big influences for me when I started working on a graphic novel. All of these people are people that I sort of looked up to and people that I asked for advice on how I should move forward in my own work and how it might be possible to work as a graphic novelist in Egypt. Another artist I really love is Mohamed Salah. He's a contributor to Tuk Tuk, and he makes really lovely, particularly dystopian comics. These are people, if any of you are interested in looking them up later, these are people I definitely advise looking into. Ganzir is also a big one. He's also someone who had to leave Egypt, but he's also someone whose illustrations are very sharp and very interesting, and I also quite enjoy his style of cartooning in many ways. He currently is publishing in English, so I would also check out his work. He's a great Egyptian comics artist. And that's it. This is my work. These are some panels from Shubeik Lubeik. As you can see, I work in Arabic and in English. And I sort of try to do this thing where I depict Cairo, but because it's set in an alternate universe where you can buy and sell wishes, it's meant to feel about like Cairo, but it's not a specific place in Cairo. So this one, if you look at the image on the left, it feels like Cairo. Everyone who looks at it recognizes that it's Cairo, but it couldn't tell you exactly where it is. So I tried to take like different places and make them into like this feeling of Cairo pastiche. And on the right, you have one of the black and white pages, and this is a wish measurement machine. So this is the machine that you put a wish into to measure what class of wish it is. It's worth noting that in the book, if you steal a wish, then it drops a class. So it goes from a first class wish to a second class wish. So you can only take a wish with permission, like with consent. And these are some of the more black and white pages. So in the style of cartooning, I tried to make it feel familiar to Egyptian readers. So it has some of this exaggeration of features, and sort of some of this like flat and shaped sort of use of black and white. And then you have also as well the color pages, which again are just sort of meant to evoke a sense of place and a sense of like, this is Cairo. I just really enjoy depicting like normal everyday things. So like what someone's bedside table might look like, how someone, wakes up and goes to work. So this is Shukri, the main character, who owns a kiosk, and this is like a kind of a typical Cairo kiosk in all of the different things that crowd the street. So this is, I figure I'd leave this here just in case we have some time for questions. So this is from Shubeik Lubeik. You can read it right now in English or in Arabic. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop here for questions.